On top of the stunning landscapes of the North Atlantic, what stood out to us on our recent trip to St. John's, Newfoundland was the cost of housing. The average price of a home in St. John's is $325,000, which is eye-wateringly cheap to those of us who live in high cost of living areas like Ontario, British Columbia, California, or New York, where you'd expect to pay 2, 3, 4, or even 5 times as much for an average home. Rent is similarly low at under $1,000 for a one-bedroom in the city center. This cheap housing isn't just a result of low salaries either. St. John's has pretty normal incomes for a Canadian city. Housing really is more affordable there. A mortgage for the average home takes up less of the average family's income in St. John's than it does in a city like Ottawa or especially Toronto. The difference is legitimately shocking.
If you're not careful, living in a high cost of living city like San Francisco or Toronto really has the potential to mess with your brain. It's easy to end up complacent or nihilistic about housing, thinking that exorbitant prices are a normal and inescapable reality of life, and that there's nothing we can do about it, short of a fundamental restructuring of our economic system. We don't want to discourage anyone from dreaming big about different kinds of economic systems, but our problem is when this comes along with a cynicism or a learned helplessness that leads people to reject incremental progress. Maybe we should respond to the housing crisis by loosening zoning rules and allowing more housing to be built, especially denser options that tend to be more affordable. According to many activists, no, that's just trickle-down housing, a giveaway to private developers who would never build housing that's in reach of the average person.
It's easy to see why people who live in high cost of living cities would learn to think that all new housing is luxury housing for rich people, but they're living in a bubble. Lots of cities have more functional housing markets. We saw this recent development 20 minutes outside of St. John's, advertising homes starting at $275,000. Within the subdivision, this duplex with 2 units was on the market for $310,000. This larger home with a garage and what appears to be a basement apartment had recently sold for under $500,000. Yes, all of this is typical North American car-focused suburbia. It doesn't exactly line up with our urbanist ideals, but it's still a lot cheaper than almost any housing in Ontario or British Columbia, whether car-dependent suburbia or condos in a walkable neighborhood.
Of course, you might say, but there's a lot less demand to live in St. John's than in the expensive cities. That's true. Despite the beautiful landscapes, Newfoundland is kind of remote. It even has its own time zone. St. John's is growing, but it's not adding population as fast as other cities, and that does put less pressure on housing. But this proves our point, that the price of housing is determined by local market conditions, not some universal fact of life, or at least fact of our economic system, that developers and homeowners can always get away with charging $1 or $2 million for a home like they can in expensive cities. If you accept that demand affects prices, you have to also accept that supply does too. Supply and demand are two sides of the same coin. You can't separate them.
St. John's just happens to be the place we visited most recently that gave us a lot of great footage of colorful houses and impressive landscapes. But this particular city isn't really the point of this video. Lots of other cities have functional housing markets that should put to rest the idea that housing, especially new housing, just can't ever be affordable. That's not a law of the universe. It's what happens when high-demand cities make the choice to make housing difficult to build, especially denser options that overall provide more supply and individually tend to be more affordable.
Looking at different cities provides much-needed perspective, but a more sophisticated approach would take into account differences between cities in construction costs, materials, land, labor, etc. In a paper titled, "Supply Constraints Have Increased Prices of Condos in Canadian Cities," researchers from Canada's Federal Housing Authority do this and find that supply constraints have increased prices of condos in Canadian cities. They adapted an influential analysis on urban economics to calculate how cheap new housing could be if builders were constrained not by height or density limits, but instead only by construction costs. They looked at Canada's 3 big metro areas.
Greater Vancouver had the most inflated market over the past 20 years. By the last year of the study, 2018, condos in the city of Vancouver were 42% more expensive than they needed to be. A condo that might otherwise be $500,000 if produced in abundance gets inflated beyond $700,000 due to supply restrictions. Condo prices in Greater Toronto are also quite single-family detached from construction costs, but this happened more recently, since 2017 or 2018. Greater Montreal has a healthy condo market where prices are more in line with construction costs, but prices are more elevated in the central city, which the researchers link to Montreal's downtown height limit constraining supply.
There are a few caveats with this result. First, it's a few years old. The last year covered is 2018, and house prices shot off into the stratosphere in 2020 and 2021. The COVID era did see construction cost pressures too, though, so it would be good to have an updated analysis to see where we stand now. Second, this study looked at whether policies like height limits block viable supply and push condo prices too far above construction costs. It did not look at how other policies act directly to inflate construction costs. Mandating too much parking can add tens of thousands to the price of a condo. Limiting condos or apartments to a small portion of the city, almost a pathology in the Greater Toronto and Vancouver areas at this point, makes land more expensive because there's so little of it that you're allowed to build on, and also necessitates taller and taller buildings, which require more costly materials and construction methods. We can solve this not with stricter height limits that bring supply down, but instead just by legalizing low and mid-rise condos and apartments universally across our cities, to accelerate more different kinds of supply in addition to high-rises.
To be clear, no two cities are the same, and you can't assume that one city can have exactly the same housing outcomes as another city. But at the same time, you can't sit in your expensive city bubble and proclaim that the price to buy or rent a home in Toronto or Los Angeles is an inevitable and universal outcome of capitalism or whatever. All the evidence points to the most expensive cities being as extreme as they are because of specific policy choices made by politicians and the people who voted for them. Failure to recognize this could be described as housing nihilism, the idea that nothing we do matters and there's no point in making incremental policy improvements. Short of a revolution, housing will always be extremely expensive, and it's just the way of the world, the nature of greedy developers, homeowners, and landlords. But the housing market looks a lot different when you leave the bubble of high-demand cities that are supply-constrained.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget that expensive housing is a policy choice that we don't have to make. A special thanks, as always, to our wonderful community of supporters on Patreon.